The night a bear broke into a cabin and became friends with the owner. Part 1. The Intruder in the Night. The night was quiet, save for the distant howling of the wind as it wove through the towering pine trees. The stars blinked through the thick forest canopy, casting faint silver light over the lonely landscape. Deep in the Montana wilderness, in a secluded cabin at the edge of a sprawling valley, Daniel Carter sat in his worn leather chair, sipping a steaming cup of coffee. It had been years since he had chosen this life, one of solitude, of self-reliance, away from the noise of the modern world. His days were spent fishing in the nearby river, chopping wood, and living off the land as much as he could. The wilderness was unpredictable, but it was home. As he reached for a book, a sudden sound shattered the silence. A low, creaking noise. Daniel froze. The wooden porch outside groaned under the weight of something heavy. His instincts sharpened. He had lived in the wild long enough to recognize the distinct sound of an animal stepping where it shouldn't. Then bang, the door burst open. Daniel shot to his feet, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. Standing in the doorway, framed by the moonlight, was a grizzly bear, massive, broad-shouldered, its fur thick and matted from the damp night air. Its deep black eyes locked onto him, unblinking. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, neither of them moved. Daniel had encountered bears before, but never like this. Never one that had walked straight into his home. His rifle was propped against the far wall, too far to reach without provoking the beast. His instincts screamed at him to react, to make himself look big, to yell, to do something. But instead, he did nothing. The bear sniffed the air, taking a step inside. The wooden floor creaked under its weight. Daniel's hands tightened around his coffee mug as he slowly, deliberately, did not move. The bear's nose twitched, its gaze shifting past Daniel, toward the small wooden table where his dinner sat untouched. A plate of roasted venison, some leftover bread, and a half-eaten piece of pie. Daniel exhaled, a slow and measured breath. It wasn't hunting him. It was hungry, a test of nerves. Daniel had spent enough time in the wild to know that fear was the greatest enemy. Animals sensed it. They reacted to it. And with a bear this large, any wrong move could mean disaster. Carefully, he took a slow step backward, never breaking eye contact. The bear took another cautious step inside, its massive claws clicking against the wooden floor. The air in the cabin felt heavy. Then, in the most surreal moment of Daniel's life, the bear sat down, right there, in the middle of the room. It huffed, exhaling a deep breath, its nostrils flaring as it continued to eye the food on the table. Daniel swallowed. What the hell do I do now? His mind raced through every possible scenario. Running wasn't an option. He wouldn't make it 2 steps before the bear could reach him. Fighting? Out of the question. And scaring it off? He doubted it would work when it had just broken through his door like it owned the place. So, in the strangest, most reckless decision of his life, Daniel reached for his plate. With slow, deliberate movements, he cut a piece of venison and set it down on the floor between them. The bear's ears flicked forward. A low rumble vibrated in its chest, a sound Daniel couldn't quite decipher. Was it annoyance? Curiosity? Amusement? The bear lowered its massive head, sniffing the meat. Then, it ate. Daniel Carter had just fed a wild grizzly bear inside his own cabin. A silent agreement. Time moved strangely after that. Daniel remained still, watching as the bear finished the small offering. It licked its nose, exhaled another deep breath, then looked at him again. It wanted more. Daniel hesitated. Was he making a terrible mistake? Was he teaching this bear that cabins equaled food? Probably. But at that moment, survival took priority over logic. He reached for another slice, this time placing it closer to the door. The bear followed, stepping forward, its claws clicking against the wooden planks. It took the food without hesitation. Chewing slowly, Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. If this worked, he could get the bear back outside. He just had to be patient. Another piece, another step toward the door. Then, the last slice, placed just outside the cabin entrance. The bear paused, studying him. Then, as if satisfied, it lumbered forward, Stepping back outside into the night, Daniel exhaled hard, his entire body trembling. He had just survived a bear breaking into his home by sharing dinner with it. The bear didn't leave right away. It lingered on the porch, turning back to look at him one last time. For a long moment, man and beast simply stared at each other. Then, with a deep, rumbling chuck, the bear turned and disappeared into the trees. Daniel stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had he really just negotiated peace with a grizzly? Had he really just shared a meal with a bear? One thing was certain, this was not the last time he would see it. Part 5. A memory that lasts. Liam continued his hike, his mind still replaying the bizarre encounter. The bear was gone, and logic told him that was a good thing. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just experienced something rare, something most people would never believe. He reached a higher ridge and paused to take in the view. The vast wilderness stretched before him, endless pines and rolling hills fading into the horizon. It was in moments like these that he felt truly connected to nature, reminded of its unpredictability and wonder. A rustling sound behind him made him tense. His first instinct was to reach for his bear spray, but when he turned, there was nothing there, just the wind shifting through the trees. Still, his gut told him he wasn't alone. Had the bear followed him? Was it watching from the shadows? He would never know. But instead of fear, Liam felt something else, gratitude. A story worth telling. Days later, when Liam finally returned to civilization, he found himself struggling to explain what had happened. His friends listened in disbelief as he recounted the tale over a campfire, their expressions shifting between amusement and amazement. A bear just crawled into your tent and slept next to you, one of them asked. Incredulous. Yes. And you fed it protein bars instead of running for your life? Another added. Liam laughed. I didn't exactly have a choice. The story took on a life of its own. Some friends insisted he must have imagined it. Others believed he had somehow earned the bear's trust. But no matter how much he tried to downplay it, Liam knew one thing for certain. He had shared space with a wild bear and lived to tell the tale. A final encounter. A year later, Liam found himself back in the same wilderness. He hadn't planned to return to the exact spot, but something had drawn him back. Maybe curiosity, maybe nostalgia. As he walked through the familiar terrain, he couldn't help but glance around, half expecting to see a familiar dark shape in the trees. But the forest was quiet. Then, just as he reached the clearing where he had camped that fateful night, he noticed something near a fallen log, a deep impression in the dirt, a paw print. It was fresh. Liam knelt down, tracing the edges with his fingers. A slow smile spread across his face. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, he knew he would always remember the night a bear had broken into his tent, not as a moment of fear, but as a memory of the wild in its purest form. And maybe, just maybe, the bear remembered him too. Some friendships are born in the most unexpected ways. What started as a moment of fear became a story of trust, understanding, and an unbreakable bond between a man and a wild bear. What do you think of this incredible story? Would you have reacted the same way? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more unbelievable true stories. See you in the next adventure. Part 2. An unlikely dinner guest. The silence inside the cabin was thick, broken only by the rhythmic crackling of the fire. Daniel stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest, eyes locked on the massive grizzly bear now fully inside his home. The animal's enormous frame barely fit through the doorway, its broad shoulders brushing against the wooden beams. Its dark eyes scanned the small, dimly lit space, nostrils flaring as it took in the scent of food. The bear wasn't aggressive, not yet, but it also wasn't leaving. Daniel swallowed hard. He had encountered bears in the wild before, had even seen them from a distance while out hunting, but never like this, never inside his cabin. The rifle sat in the corner, out of reach. Even if he could grab it, would he use it? He knew better than to make a sudden move. If he startled the bear, it could react unpredictably. Then, the bear did something unexpected. It let out a deep huff, not a growl, not a roar, but something almost neutral, as if it wasn't quite sure what to make of the situation either. And then its eyes landed on the table. More specifically, the venison stew Daniel had been preparing. A bold decision. Instinct told Daniel to stand his ground, to make himself appear large, make noise, do something to assert dominance. But his gut told him otherwise. This bear wasn't here to attack. It was here because it smelled food. With slow, deliberate movements, Daniel took a step backward, giving the bear more space. The animal didn't move toward him. It moved toward the table, sniffing the air with interest. Daniel hesitated. Then, in the most reckless and surreal decision of his life, he grabbed a second plate from the cupboard, scooped some of the steaming stew into it, and, carefully, set it down near the opposite end of the table. The bear's ears flicked. It hesitated, as if assessing whether this was some kind of trap. Then, slowly, it stepped forward, sniffing the plate. Daniel held his breath. A moment of tension. Then, the bear ate. Daniel exhaled, barely believing what he was seeing. He had just served dinner to a grizzly bear. A silent understanding. Minutes passed in an almost surreal stillness. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the faint creaks of the wooden floor as the bear shifted, and the quiet clink of the spoon in Daniel's hands as he absent-mindedly stirred his own bowl. He couldn't believe this was happening. The bear had finished eating but remained standing near the table. It wasn't showing signs of aggression, nor did it seem in any hurry to leave. If anything, it looked comfortable. Daniel studied the massive creature. Its fur was thick, slightly damp from the snowfall outside. Its breath came in deep, steady waves, fogging slightly in the cold cabin air. It looked strong, but not desperate, not starving. This bear wasn't here out of desperation. It was here because it had chosen to be. And somehow, Daniel had chosen to let it stay. The strangest night. An hour passed, then another. The fire crackled low, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. The bear had made itself at home, sitting near the fireplace, watching Daniel with dark, unreadable eyes. Daniel had no idea what to do. Would it leave on its own? Would he have to force it out? Could he even do that? Then, as if sensing his thoughts, the bear let out another low huff, stretched its front legs, and, in the most casual, mind-boggling act Daniel had ever seen, it lay down, right there, beside the fire, as if it had always belonged there. Daniel blinked, rubbing his eyes, convinced he must be hallucinating. He had heard of strange animal encounters before, but this was something else. And against all logic, all common sense, Daniel didn't feel afraid anymore. Instead, he felt intrigued, a night unlike any other. Daniel kept his distance but didn't move from his seat. The bear, content in its newfound warmth, let out a long sigh, its massive body relaxing onto the wooden floor. It wasn't leaving anytime soon. He could have forced it out. He could have tried to make noise, to scare it, but something in him hesitated. This was a once-in-a-lifetime moment. So instead of forcing the bear away, Daniel did something crazy. He poured himself another bowl of stew, set his spoon down, and, still keeping his movements slow and deliberate, leaned back in his chair, watching the fire. And for the first time, in the most unexpected company imaginable, he felt a kind of peace. The night stretched on, man and beast sharing the same space, neither threatening the other. A strange, silent truce settled over them, one built not on words but on instinct, respect, and an understanding that neither could explain. At some point, Daniel must have drifted off, his exhaustion finally overcoming him. When he woke in the early hours of the morning, the fire had died down to soft embers, and the bear was gone. The door, which had once been nearly torn off its hinges, stood slightly ajar, revealing the dark outline of the forest beyond. A few massive paw prints were pressed into the snow outside, leading back into the trees. Daniel sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. Had it been real? Had he actually shared a meal and a night with a wild grizzly? The empty plate near the table said yes. A slow smile spread across his face as he let out a breathless chuckle. He had survived, and somehow, He had made a friend. Part 3. A returning visitor. The morning after the surreal night, Daniel sat on his porch, staring at the tracks in the snow. They were massive, trailing from his cabin back into the dense forest. The events of the previous night still played in his mind. The grizzly's cautious movements, the strange understanding they had shared, and the incredible realization that he had, somehow, survived the encounter unscathed. Had he truly made peace with a wild animal? Or had the bear simply been full and uninterested in conflict? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to forget what had happened. With a deep breath, Daniel stretched his arms, feeling the chill of the morning air settle into his bones. His breakfast sizzled on the stove, and as he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, he chuckled to himself. No one was ever going to believe this, but the strangest part, it wasn't over yet. A familiar shape in the trees. Days passed, and life in the cabin resumed its usual rhythm. Daniel chopped wood, hunted for food, and spent long hours lost in thought, often glancing toward the forest where the bear had disappeared. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, he noticed something. A shape. A massive, dark figure standing at the edge of the tree lane. His breath caught in his throat. It was the bear. It wasn't approaching, but it wasn't leaving either. It simply stood there, watching. Daniel didn't move. He knew better than to make any sudden motions. Instead, he did what he had done before. He waited. Minutes passed. The bear sniffed the air, shuffled its weight, and then, to Daniel's complete astonishment, it took a few slow steps forward. This time, it wasn't breaking in. It wasn't searching for food. It was simply returning. A curious connection. The bear's approach was deliberate but not aggressive. Its massive paws crunched lightly against the snow as it moved closer to the cabin. Pausing just a few yards away, it let out a low huff, its breath misting in the cold air. Daniel's grip tightened around the porch railing. This wasn't normal bear behavior. Wild animals didn't just return to visit humans. But this bear, this particular bear, was different. Against all reason, he found himself speaking. "You again? Huh?" The bear let out a soft chuff, almost as if responding. Daniel hesitated. Then, just like before, he made a choice. He went inside, grabbed a portion of smoked meat from his supplies, and walked back to the porch. With slow, careful movements, he tossed the food toward the bear. Just like he had the first night, the bear sniffed, took a few cautious steps forward, then ate. But this time, it didn't immediately leave afterward. Instead, it sat down. Daniel stared in disbelief. What was happening? A ritual begins. That night, the bear lingered longer than before. It remained near the cabin, watching Daniel as he went about his usual tasks. It didn't try to force its way inside, nor did it act aggressively. It was simply there, and it kept coming back. Each evening, as the sun began to set, the bear would appear at the tree line. Sometimes it would wait for Daniel to acknowledge it before stepping forward. Other times, it would simply settle nearby, as if the presence of the man was somehow comforting. Daniel found himself accepting the strange companionship more than he ever thought possible. He even started leaving small portions of food outside, not enough to make the bear reliant on him, but enough to acknowledge their odd relationship. The more time passed, the more he realized something surprising. He wasn't afraid anymore. The night of the storm. Weeks passed, and winter deepened. The nights grew colder, the wind howling through the valley with a force that rattled the walls of Daniel's cabin. One particular evening, as a heavy snowstorm rolled in, he prepared for a long night, reinforcing the windows and adding extra logs to the fire. Then, just as he was settling in, he heard it, a heavy thud against the cabin wall. His pulse spiked. He grabbed his rifle, moving toward the door cautiously. The wind roared outside, snow swirling in thick sheets, obscuring visibility. But when he peered through the window, his breath caught. The bear was there, and it wasn't just standing. It was pressed against the side of the cabin, shielding itself from the brutal wind. Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. This wasn't part of their usual pattern. The bear had never sought shelter near the cabin before. But tonight was different. The storm was brutal, the temperatures plunging, and the bear, despite its size and strength, had come seeking warmth. A wild bear, seeking shelter from the storm, with him. For a long moment, Daniel stood at the door, gripping the handle tightly. Every instinct told him to be cautious, to let nature take its course. But something deeper, something unspoken between them, told him this was a moment of trust. And in that moment, he made his decision. Daniel took a deep breath, then did something that defied every rule of survival he had ever known. He opened the door. Part 4. Shelter from the storm. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin walls as snow piled against the windows. Daniel stood frozen, his fingers wrapped around the door handle, staring into the swirling blizzard outside. And there, against the side of the cabin, huddled the massive grizzly bear. It should have been impossible, unthinkable. A wild bear seeking shelter beside a human's home. And yet, here it was. Daniel hesitated only a moment longer before pulling the door open wider. A gust of freezing air swept into the cabin, making the flames in the fireplace flicker wildly. The bear, sensing the movement, lifted its head, snowflakes clinging to its thick fur. "Come on," Daniel muttered, stepping back. "If you're gonna stay, at least get out of the wind." For a long moment, the bear simply watched him. Then, as if understanding, it lumbered forward, stepping carefully through the threshold. The wooden floor creaked under its weight as it shook off the snow, sending a light dusting across the cabin. Daniel took another step back, watching as the bear sniffed the air, then turned toward the fire. It didn't charge. It didn't growl. It simply walked to the warmest spot in the room and sat down. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. An uneasy coexistence. The storm raged outside for hours, the wind battering the cabin like a relentless force of nature. Inside, an eerie but oddly peaceful silence had settled between man and beast. Daniel kept his distance, seated at the small wooden table, watching as the bear rested by the fire. He wasn't sure how long this strange arrangement would last, but as long as the storm raged on, they were stuck together. The bear eventually curled up, its thick fur rising and falling with each slow breath. It was calm, relaxed even. But Daniel wasn't foolish enough to let his guard down completely. Every so often, the bear would lift its head, sniff the air, and glance in Daniel's direction before settling again. Daniel sighed. "You better not make a habit of this." The bear chuffed softly, a sound that almost sounded amused. A test of trust. The night stretched on, the fire crackling as the only source of warmth and light. Eventually, Daniel's exhaustion caught up with him. He knew he should stay awake. How does one sleep with a bear in the same room? But his eyelids grew heavy. He must have drifted off at some point because the next thing he knew, the bear was moving. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding. The massive creature was standing now, sniffing at the shelves near the kitchen area. Daniel swallowed hard. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice even. "That's not yours." The bear paused, looking at him, the two locked eyes. And for a moment, Daniel feared he had made a mistake letting it inside. But then, the bear backed away. It understood. Daniel let out a slow breath. He stood, reaching for a small piece of dried meat from his supplies. He walked cautiously toward the bear and placed the food on the floor. "Here," he said softly. "This is yours." The bear hesitated, but eventually took it, chewing slowly before returning to its spot by the fire. A quiet agreement had been made. Boundaries were set, and trust was forming. The morning after, when dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. Daniel stretched, his muscles stiff from the night before. And then he realized the bear was still there. It was awake now, sitting up, watching the door, not trying to leave, not anxious, just waiting. Daniel stepped forward cautiously. "You know you can go now, right?" The bear turned its head toward him, blinking slowly. It let out a deep sigh before finally standing, shaking itself, and lumbering toward the door. Daniel hesitated before pulling it open. The cold morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of fresh snow and pine. The bear took a final look at the cabin, then stepped outside, moving slowly through the untouched snow. Daniel watched as it disappeared into the tree line. He should have felt relieved. He should have been glad to have his space back. But instead, he felt something else entirely. Something like loss. Because somehow, in the strangest way possible, he had come to enjoy the presence of the bear. And deep down, he had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time they met.